Welcome to this video, which is part 2 of fear. Let's continue. Hopefully you did the exercise, which involved writing down your greatest fears and starting to access the actual feeling of what that feels like. And you will have experienced facing some of those deepest fears. You would have experienced what that actually feels like in your body, which is the first step in allowing it to come up so that you can surrender it and be free from it. So we're going to dive a little deeper in this episode into the shadow and also guilt, so we can really get to what's at the root and the heart of fear, so we can surrender it. Owning the shadow. One of the blocks to emotional development is the fear of what lies buried in our unconscious. Carl Jung called this area which we're unwilling to look at and to own the shadow. He said that the self cannot become healed and whole unless we look at and acknowledge the shadow. This means that buried within all of us, in what Jung called the collective unconscious, is everything that we most dislike admitting about ourselves. The average human, he said, would much rather project his shadow onto the world and condemn it and see it as evil, thinking that his problem is to battle with evil in the world. In actuality, the problem is merely to acknowledge the presence of such thoughts and impulses in ourselves, just recognizing that that's coming from us. By acknowledging them, they become quiet. Once they're quiet, they no longer unconsciously run us. It's the exact same thing. It's the letting go technique in principle. Acknowledging the feelings inside of us, taking back that ownership of going, oh yeah, it's all out in the world. Like, evil is in the world. It's dangerous. Bad things happen out there. Coming back and realizing that this is all our own projection, which is coming from a place of fear. And by just doing that, it loses all power. Can't control us anymore. In looking at our fears of the unknown, which are really fears of what is in the depths of the unconscious, it's useful to have a sense of humor. Once looked at and acknowledged, the shadow no longer has any power. In fact, it's only our fear of these thoughts and impulses that give them any power. Once we become acquainted with our shadow, we no longer have to project our fears upon the world, and they begin to evaporate rapidly. What makes the endless television programs which are concerned with mayhem in its various forms so attractive? It's because what is being acted out on the screen, where it's safe, are all the forbidden unconscious fantasies in our own psyche. Once we're willing to look at the same movies on the TV screen of our own minds and see whence they really originate, the attraction of such entertainment disappears. People who've acknowledged the content of their own shadow have no interest in crime, violence, and fearful disasters. It's really so popular in society. Fear, violence, crime. Where does that come from? It comes from all of our projected fears, which are safe out there, but we don't want to own because that means taking responsibility. So it's all about just bringing it back to you. One of the blocks of becoming acquainted with the fears in one's own mind is the fear of the opinions of others. The wanting of their approval goes on inside of our minds in a constant fantasy. We identify with the opinions of others, including authority figures, and coalesce this in such a way that we hear it as our own opinion of ourselves. In looking at fears then, it's well to remember that Carl Jung saw this reservoir of the forbidden in general, inside the shadow as a part of the collective unconscious. This is really interesting stuff. The term collective unconscious means that everybody has these thoughts and fears. Well, we all have those same things. Everyone has those same fantasies. There's nothing unique about any of us when it comes to the way we symbolize our emotions. Everybody secretly harbors that fear that they're dumb, ugly, unlovable, and a failure. The unconscious mind is not polite. It thinks in gross concepts. When it thinks of the phrase, murder the bum, the unconscious mind literally means that. Look deep within yourself the next time someone cuts you off in traffic and picture what you would really do to that person if you're strictly honest with yourself and didn't censor the image that came to mind. You'd like to run them off the road, wouldn't you? Pulverize them, push them off the cliff. Isn't that right? That's the way the unconscious mind works. The reason that a sense of humor is useful is because these images are comical once we look at them. There's nothing awful about it. It's just the way the unconscious handles images. It doesn't mean that you're a rotten person or that you're potentially a criminal. It just means that you've gotten honest and faced how the human animal mind operates in this dimension. There's no point in getting melodramatic, self-critical, or tragic about it. The unconscious is crude and uncivilized. While your intellect went to prep school, your unconscious mind remained in the jungle where it's still swinging in the trees. Looking at the shadow side is not a time to get prissy or squeamish. It's not a time to take it literally either, because the symbols of the unconscious are just that. They're symbols, and they're primitive in nature. If worked with consciously, they can empower us rather than inhibit us. It takes a lot of energy to keep the shadow buried and to suppress our multitude of fears. The result is energy depletion. On the emotional level, it's expressed as an inhibition of the capacity to love. This is serious stuff. The more we're suppressing these fears, the more we're not facing our shadow, the more fault we're finding with the world and those who are close to us, and the less we can love. This is serious stuff. We want to really start to pay attention and get sincere about ourselves and the role that we play in all of this, because by doing that, we're going to find real freedom. In the world of consciousness, like goes to like, so that fear attracts fear, just as its corollary is true, that love attracts love. The more fear we hold, the more fearful situations we attract into our life. Each fear requires additional energy to create a protective device until finally all of our energy is drained into our extensive defensive measures. The willingness to look at fear and work with it until we're free of it brings about immediate rewards. Each of us has within us a certain reservoir of suppressed and repressed fear. This quantity of fear spills into all areas of our life, colors all of our experience, decreases our joy in life, and reflects itself in the musculature of the face so as to affect our physical appearance, our physical strength, and the condition of health in all of the organs in the body. Sustained and chronic fear gradually suppresses the body's immune system. With kinesiologic testing, we can instantly demonstrate that a fearful thought causes a major reduction in muscle power and deranges the energy flow down the body's energy meridians to the body's vital organs. Although we know that it's totally damaging to our relationships, health, and happiness, we still hang on to fear. Why is that? We have the unconscious fantasy that fear is keeping us alive. This is because fear is associated with our survival, with a whole set of survival mechanisms which are biological. We have the fear that if we were to let go of fear, our main defense mechanism, without our main defense mechanism, we'd become vulnerable in some way. In reality, the truth is just the opposite. Fear is what blinds us to the real dangers of life. In fact, fear itself is the greatest danger that the human body faces. It's fear and guilt that bring about disease and failure in every area of our life. We could take the same protective actions out of love rather than out of fear. Can we not care for our bodies because we appreciate and value them rather than out of fear of disease and dying? It's all about moving into, again, these higher levels of awareness where all of our motivation is coming from a different place. Whereas before you might have gone to work because you're motivated by not getting fired, not getting kicked out of your house, not having all your physical possessions repossessed. Maybe that's some of the that's some of the energy which is driving us to go to work, for example. But as we start to surrender this, then we can have a new motivation. And this is a point which I really want to drive home, because this was a struggle for me for a long time. Back to emotions like fear being biological, being programmed deep into our unconscious mind. Once we let go of fear, once we let go of any lower motivation, we've got this, or I used to have this unconscious belief that by doing that, if I don't have any fear, then how am I going to be motivated to do stuff? But here's the trick. Once you let go of that lower motivation, it gets replaced by a higher one. All lower motivations are automatically replaced by a higher one once we clear them. So you don't need to worry that by letting go of fear, your life's going to fall apart. Actually, it's going to become more powerful, more loving, and higher in vibration, and you're going to have an effect on all of the people who you influence, who are in your life, for the positive. Can we not be of service to others in our life out of love rather than out of fear of losing them? Another example. Can we not be polite and courteous to strangers because we care for our fellow human beings rather than because we fear losing their opinion of us, losing their good opinion of us? Can we not do a good job because we care about the quality of our performance and we care about our fellow workers? Can we not perform our job well because we care about the recipients of our services rather than just the fear of losing our job or pursuing our own ambition? Can we not accomplish more by cooperation rather than fearful competition? Can we not drive carefully because we have a higher regard for ourselves and care for our welfare and those who love us, rather than because we fear an accident? On a spiritual level, isn't it more effective if, out of compassion and identification with our fellow human beings, we care for them rather than trying to love them out of fear of God's punishment if we don't? So now we're going to look at guilt. One particular form of fear is what we call guilt. Guilt is always associated with a feeling of wrongness and potential punishment, either real or in fantasy. If punishment is not forthcoming in the external world, it expresses itself as self-punishment on an emotional level. Wherever there's guilt, there's punishment. Either we want to sabotage ourselves by things that happen in the external world, like losing our job or having accidents or relationship issues, or we emotionally punish ourselves. As long as there's guilt there, there's that punishment thing going on. Guilt accompanies all of the negative emotions, and thus, where there is fear, there's guilt. If you think a guilty thought, actually, I think that's worth just pausing on for a sec. Where there's fear, there's guilt. They go together. So if you want to deal with guilt, deal with fear. If you want to deal with fear, make sure you've addressed guilt as well. They go hand in hand. Guilt accompanies all of the negative emotions, and thus, where there's fear, there's guilt. If you think of guilty thought and have someone test your muscle strength, you'll see that the muscle instantly goes weak. Your cerebral hemisphere has become desynchronized, and all of your energy meridians are thrown out of balance. Nature, therefore, says that guilt is destructive. This is not a pro-evolution emotion. This is an issue. If you want to increase your life, if you want things to go better, guilt is something that needs to actually be surrendered and let go. If guilt is so destructive, then why are there such paeans of praise allotted to it? Why do so-called experts view guilt as beneficial? For example, a psychiatrist wrote a magazine article in praise of guilt, declaring guilt is good for you. He then qualified the statement with appropriate guilt. Let's look at what guilt is really all about and see if we agree or not. When you cross the street, you look both ways to see if a car is coming. How did this come about? When you're a child, you were told that it was just bad to cross the street by yourself. Thus, we see that guilt is really a substitute for a sense of reality in a mind that's undeveloped, such as that of a child. It's a learned behavior which is purportedly pragmatic to prevent further error or the repetition of a mistake. However, 99% of guilt has nothing whatsoever to do with reality. In fact, the most pious, meek, and harmless individuals are often riddled with guilt. Guilt is really self-condemnation and self-invalidation of our own worth and value as a human being. Guilt is as prevalent as fear, and we feel guilty no matter what we're doing if this is present in our life. A part of our mind says that we really ought to be doing something else, or whatever we're actually doing at the moment, we ought to be doing it better. We should be getting a better golf score. We should be reading a book instead of watching TV. We should make love better, cook better, run faster, grow taller, be stronger, be smarter, be more educated. In between the fear of living and the fear of dying is the guilt of the moment. Whatever you're doing, it's always this niggling sense. We seek to escape it by remaining unaware of it through suppression, repression, projecting it onto others, and escapism. Remaining unconscious of guilt, repression, however, does not solve it. The guilt re-emerges in the form of self-punishment through accidents, misfortune, loss of jobs and relationships, physical disease, sickness, tiredness, exhaustion, and the multiple ways the ingenious mind figures out how to bring the loss of joy, pleasure, and aliveness because of guilt. So if you're, thinking, why is it that I always have problems in this particular area? Why is it that I always get sick? Why is it that I always feel tired or exhausted? Or any number of different things that are like recurring patterns in your life, there's a good chance that there's repressed unconscious guilt. Guilt represents death just as love represents life. Guilt is part of the smaller self and underlies our willingness to believe negative things about ourselves. The happiness and joy of the day is instantly destroyed by one negative remark from a family member, friend, or neighbor. Physical disease is unlikely to exist without guilt, and guilt is a denial of our inner intrinsic innocence. So why do we buy into so much garbage? Is it not because of our very innocence? Is it not because as we grew up, we trusted that what others were telling us was the truth? And even currently, do we still trust what others are telling us is the truth? Is it not so that we've bought into 10,000 lies and are willing to buy another 10,000 out of the naivete of our own innocence? Is it not that inner innocence is the very reason for our exploitability? In fact, when we look deep within ourselves, is it not because of our very innocence that we believe ourselves to be so guilty? It is because of our own inner innocence that we've bought into all the negativity of the world and allowed it to kill our aliveness, destroy our awareness of who we really are, and sell us the pathetic smallness for which we've settled. Is not ours the innocence of the newborn that cannot defend itself and, with no capacity for discernment, could only allow itself to be programmed like a computer? To see this means to become conscious. We hear of consciousness-raising programs and weekend seminars to expand our consciousness. What does this mean? To get some new complicated formulas? To get programmed with someone else's ideas of mystical truth? Most of the consciousness programs boil down to this essential point. Become aware of what we're buying into and what we're accepting daily. Let's look at what we've already been programmed with and begin to question it, disassemble it, and let it go. Let's wake up and free ourselves from being exploited and enslaved by the negative programming of the world. We'll see it for what it is, which is an attempt by others to control us, exploit us, extract our money, our services, our energy, our loyalties, and to capture our mind. The mechanisms whereby this comes about were so beautifully exemplified in the movie Tron, in which the very function of master control in that movie Tron was to enslave us by progressive programming. When we see the truth of how programming happens, we'll see that we are the pure blank computer. We're the innocent space in which the programming is occurring. When we look at all of this, we're going to get angry. Anger is better than resignation, apathy, depression, and grief, and fear. It means to take charge of our mind instead of handing it to the television set, the newspaper, the magazines, neighbors, Facebook, scrolling through our phones and just picking up all that garbage. The conversations on the train, the chance remarks of the waitress, the garbage in and the garbage out. What went into our memory banks was garbage. And when we see this, we will have much less fear. We will enjoy starting to let the feelings come up, seeing them for what they are, clearing out all of the garbage and letting it all go. Once we've looked deep within ourselves and found that innate inner innocence, we'll stop hating ourselves. We'll stop condemning ourselves and stop buying into the condemnation of others and their subtle attempts to invalidate our worth as human beings. It's time to re-own our power and stop giving it away to every passing scammer who jiggles our fears and shakes loose some money out of our pocketbooks or enslaves us to their cause, living off our low energy. It's easy to get away from all that fear because we have the power of choice now. We fear that the inner voyage of discovery will lead us to some dreadful, awful truth. I used to fear this. I used to fear that if I started doing personal development and then going deeper into spirituality and then going deeper into just coming to terms with reality itself and going deeper into myself, I had a fear that I was going to become depressed and suicidal. And I think for a lot of people, there's that fear there of, if I look within too much, I'm going to become a narcissist, or, I'm going to become a horrible person. But in reality, the more we look in and question all of these beliefs that we've carried through our entire life, the more we can disassemble these complexes which are made up of fear and just be free from that. In this programming of our minds, so back to the state of our minds, this is one of the barriers that the world has set, having that fear that there's something horrible and dreadful in there. This is one of the barriers that the world has set up to prevent us from finding out the real truth. There's one thing the world does not want us to find out, and that's the truth about ourselves. Why? Because then we'll become free. We can no longer be controlled, manipulated, exploited, drained, enslaved, imprisoned, vilified, or disempowered. Therefore, the inner voyage of discovery is cloaked over with an aura of mystery and foreboding. That's not a mistake. What is the real truth about this voyage? The real truth is that as we go deeper within and discard one illusion after another, one falsehood after another, one negative program after another, it gets lighter and lighter. The awareness of the presence of love becomes stronger and stronger. We'll feel lighter and lighter. Life becomes progressively more effortless. Every great teacher since the beginning of time has said to look within and find the truth. For the truth of what we really are will set us free. If what is to be found within ourselves was something to be guilty about, something that's rotten, evil, and negative, then all the world's great teachers would not advise us to look there. On the contrary, they would tell us to avoid it at all costs. We will discover that all of the things that the world calls evil are right on the surface, they're right on the top. As the superficial outer thin layer, as you start to journey within and do more of this work, all that fear of being evil and guilt and all the fear of what's within, that's just on the surface layer, that's just that programming layer. Once you go within deeper than that, things start to become light and free and more full of love. Beneath those errors is mistakenness. We're not rotten, only ignorant. As the quantity of guilty fear and the energy accompanying it are relinquished, we'll notice that physical diseases and symptoms begin to disappear. The capacity to love ourselves in the form of increased self-esteem returns, and with it comes the capacity to love others. Being freed from guilt brings about a renewal of life energy. This can be dramatically witnessed in many people who are converted through religious experiences. The sudden freedom from guilt through the mechanism of forgiveness is responsible for thousands of recoveries from serious and advanced diseases. Whether or not we agree with their religious concepts is immaterial, which is another really interesting point about supernatural healing, is that what's actually going on there? Is it that somebody who has all this power is just projecting that onto the person and just, that it's like they're doing it to them, they're healing them? Or is it that this person is allowing themselves to receive their own health, their own vital essence, which is inside them, because this person out here who radiates so much love has opened up a space for this person to receive that healing? Both. And this is the power of letting go of fear and guilt. This is the power of letting your own life flow. Whether or not we agree with their religious concept, so again, not getting caught up with, who is this person? What's their faith? What's their religion? It's like, what is that person radiating? What's that person emanating? So whether or not we get caught up in their concepts is immaterial. What's important is to notice that the alleviation of guilt is accompanied by a resurgence of life energy, well-being, and physical health. When it comes to healing ourselves and increasing our own emotional health, it pays to be paranoid, in inverted commas. We become aware of all the guilt mongers in our life and their deleterious influence. We can ask ourselves, couldn't we achieve the same motivation or behavior out of love rather than out of fear and guilt? Is guilt the only reason we don't stab our neighbor? Why couldn't it be that we could refuse to stab our neighbor because we love and care for him as a fellow human being who's intrinsically innocent and who's struggling to grow, but might make mistakes along the way just as we ourselves have done? Would not following religious teachings, whatever they are, be more effective if done out of love and appreciation than out of guilt and fear? We can ask ourselves, what do we really need guilt for anyway? Think about it. What possible service do we get out of it? Are we so miserably stupid that we only behave out of guilt? Are we that unconscious? Cannot consideration for the feelings of others replace guilt as a motivation for appropriate human behavior? It's all about just leveling up. That's all we're doing here, just leveling up. Living life from a completely different set of motivation, maybe even doing very similar things, but feeling very differently, and others feeling very differently about us as we do those same things. As we examine these issues and we look at their social origins, we see that the Middle Ages are far from over. The Inquisition has merely taken on newer and subtler forms of cruelty. We have unwittingly bought into a system of negativity that's now currently running the planet. To make wrong and to make guilty is really a form of cruelty, is it not? We've allowed others to program us with methods of self-torture, and we can see that we've retaliated by inviting others to torture themselves in return. We've allowed ourselves to be manipulated by guilt, and we turn it around and use that same mechanism of guilt to try and exploit and control others. The degree to which we have not allowed ourselves to experience the reality of our true self is represented by our resentment towards those who've actually done so. We resent their aliveness in the areas in which we feel disabled. This sobering truth is represented by the story of the man who walks along the beach and comes upon a fisherman with a pail full of crabs. He says to the fisherman, "You'd better put a cover on that pail or the crabs will get out." "Well, no," said the wise old fisherman. "There's no need for that. You see, as one crab crawls up the side of the pail to get out, the other crabs reach up and grab him and pull him back down. So, there's no need for a cover." As we keep letting go getting lighter and becoming freer, we will unfortunately see that the nature of the world is like that pail of crabs. So if you're on this journey, you've got to be ready for people who want to project their negativity onto you and pull you back down again, because we all got to be in this together, right? And then the full extent of its negativity becomes apparent. When we become totally aware of the bill of goods that we've been sold, it's very likely that we'll feel anger and a strong desire to become liberated from the constraints of negativity. So that is the last episode on fear for now. And I think the major things covered there were the shadow and also guilt as being big components of fear. So for the exercise today, again, get out your notebook or your journal or your Word doc or whatever you use, and we're going to make 2 lists. The first list is list out all of the things about other people that you hate. Yeah? All the things that piss you off about other people. And maybe just think of 1 or 2 people that really annoy you. It could be their cockiness, their arrogance. It could be their short temper. It could be their manipulative nature, how they seem to manipulate other people. It could be just that they seem like they've got bad intentions. Could be that they are critical and you just hate that. You hate how critical they are. And then get in closer and think about family members, because this is going to really unearth the things that trigger you the most and really get you acquainted with what your shadow actually is. What are those characteristics that you push down in your own consciousness? And so as a consequence of that, you find yourself seeing it out there in the world. That's how it works. Once you've got that list, so again, the things that really piss you off about other people, write out that list and see how much you can trigger yourself. And what that's going to show you is all of the things about yourself that you've unowned, all the parts of yourself that you don't love, that you haven't accepted or acknowledged. So do that first. Once you realize, oh, okay, all of this is actually me and I've just been projecting this out onto the world, start to go through those things one by one over the next few days, over the next few weeks, and start to acknowledge that that's coming from you. What that's going to do is bring you into harmony with your shadow, bit by bit. Don't have to do it all at once, but it's going to start to bring you into greater harmony with your shadow, which is all this suppressed stuff. Doesn't mean that you start becoming a horrible person and that you start acting out those traits. It means that you take responsibility for those things and you realize that that's just coming from me. And by taking responsibility and actually just observing it, which is all this letting go technique is, observing the feelings that those traits bring up in you and just allowing them to be there, this is going to start to dissipate. So that's number 1. Number 2 is make a list of all of the ways in which you feel most guilty. What are you most guilty about? What are the things that bring a sense of guilt up for you? And again, start the list, but there'll probably be things you can add to it over the coming days and weeks. What makes you feel guilty? And then, what is the belief that's driving that feeling of guilt? So for example, I used to feel really guilty when I was interacting with someone, and because of what we're talking about or what came up in the conversation, they would feel strong feelings of sadness, for example. And when I looked at the belief underneath that, oh, I feel guilty now because that person feels sad. The belief was, I have to make people feel good. I have to, otherwise that means I'm a shit person, right? It's like a really common one. But when you look at that belief and go, hang on a sec, where did this come from? When did it become my responsibility to make other people happy, or to make sure that other people were always happy no matter what was going on for me? And so now I've deconstructed that, and that's what we're doing with all of this. We're disassembling these emotional complexes which are built up from traumas, experiences we've had, programming and beliefs, pulling it all apart and letting it dissolve. So make that list. What are all those things that make you feel guilty? What's the underlying belief underneath that? Where did that belief come from? And then just start to accept those feelings. Accept, acknowledge, allow those feelings to come up and acknowledge their presence, not trying to change them, not trying to make them go away or manipulate them, just allowing them to be there. And over time, as we do that, they just disappear because we're not in resistance to them. So I hope you really enjoyed that episode. We'll go into fear in future episodes, but that's really the core of how fear operates. And that's the core of how you can actually start to clear it out of your life for good, and not just psych yourself up and face your fear and bust through your fear. We're working on a much deeper level here. So thank you. Leave your comments and your questions below. Hit that like button, and make sure you share this with a friend who would benefit from it. I hope you're having some really transformative experiences as we go through this together. I really want to hear about them, and I will see you on the next video.